Hello, I'm Gina Poulos. Welcome to the vibrant capital of Greece, Athens. Today I'll be talking with a highly celebrated and sometimes controversial expatriate Australian professor of economics, former finance minister of Greece, and now leading figure in the movement for democratisation in Europe, Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis was born in Athens, Greece, but pursued his studies and worked in England for more than a decade, and of course spent many years in Australia where he taught economics at Sydney University before returning to his native Greece. Yanis shares his recollections of Australian life and his thoughts on the lucky country, both past and present. Thank you, Yanis, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You left Greece as an 18-year-old to study in England like many Greek students. You completed a doctorate in economics and got your first academic position at the University of Essex. What prompted you to leave England and travel all the way to Australia?
Thatcherism. 10 years of living under Maggie Thatcher in Britain was an exercise in depression. I loved England and hated it at the same time, like English people love and hate their country. It goes with the territory. But that was a very depressing period, a period of mass unemployment, of constant cuts in the university. So I lived all my life, both as a student and as an academic, in universities, and the universities were just absolutely miserable. Professors, lecturers, students, everybody was experiencing a psychological collapse. And so when Thatcher won the third election in 1987, third successive election, I started thinking to myself, I've got to get out of here. But I didn't know where to go. I couldn't come back to Greece because the army was waiting for me with open arms. Back then, the European continent was not as it is today. You couldn't get jobs on the basis of the English language. I couldn't teach at the academic level in France or Germany. So I felt at some point that I was condemned to live out my days in Britain until I got a telegram, back in the old days of telegrams, from the University of Sydney offering me a position completely out of the blue. I had not applied for it and turned it down initially. And then I got a second telegram saying, don't be silly, come for 6 months, and if you don't like it, you return, which I did.
Right.
And I stayed.
I'm glad you did. What were your first impressions of Australia?
I loved it. Firstly, the weather. After Cambridge and East Anglia and Essex, I got a small flat in Bondi, and I was commuting between the beach and the university, and I thought, why have I not done this years ago? It was absolutely wonderful. And also Australian, that was 1988. In 1988, under the Labour government at the time, there was an air of progress, of optimism. Multiculturalism was well established at the time. It was a very progressive society at the time. Very soon after that, things took a turn for the worse.
Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. You took up a position as lecturer in what used to be the economics department of Sydney University. Do you recall the early days as the new kid on the block in the economics department?
Oh, absolutely, as if it was yesterday. It was a great place because it was old-fashioned. It was antiquated, and that's a good thing, because with universities, the more modern the place becomes, the less scholarly it becomes. So the tempo was slow. I remember the head of the department, a magnificent New Zealander, Warren Hogan, very right-wing guy by my standards. I'm a left-winger, he's right-winger, but we got on like house on fire. Had long, wonderful discussions, usually disagreeing with one another about everything. And he said to me, well, take 6 months off to consult your sources and get used to the place before you start teaching. That kind of regime, which no longer exists in university. Now it's proletarian. It's a proletarian existence to be a lecturer. And the other thing that I found great was the pluralism. There were 2 degrees in the department at the time, a standard neoclassical mainstream economics degree. And then there was the political economy stream, which was called economics as a social science at the time. So, and those were rebels that had fallen out with the mainstream of the economy, so they had their own degree. And I was the only lecturer, and that was a great privilege and joy to be teaching on both degrees. So that was magnificent. All that is dead now. All that is dead now.
Right, so I guess my next question is going to be about your colleagues. What did you think of your colleagues? Were you made to feel welcome? Were there many other continental academics in the department at the time?
They were all wonderful. I can't even remember a single person who was not welcoming and nice, some more than others. And yes, it was a mixture. You had the Anglos. When I say Anglos, I'm talking about primarily people from England who had moved in the 70s seeking refuge to Australian academia. There were some Australians, some Anglo-Saxon Australians. There were a couple of Jewish colleagues, remarkable, fascinating, wonderful, my great friends, and at the same time annoying and you know, people that I used to have great fights with, because this is what we Mediterraneans do when we like each other. It was a couple of Italians. It was a genuine academic, scholarly, mixed community.
Positive, progressive.
Yes, and even some of them had the traditional laid-back Australian attitude of, you know, let's not harry things too much. So in terms of what today we would pass as academic performance, their performance was rather mediocre by today's standards. And here is an important point. Activity is not necessarily the same thing as quality. So today, academics feel the need to keep proving that they do a million of things. So if they have 2 good ideas, they never put it in 1 paper. They have to write 2 papers or 6 papers with 2 good ideas, because they want to show that they've done 6 rather than 1. When they don't have any ideas, they still write and pollute the universe with papers that are nonsensical. Back then, people took their time to read, to discuss, and then when they had something to say, they said it. I miss those times.
Do you think the standard of education has dropped then, as a whole, in the university world?
The standards of university education, both in Australia and the United Kingdom, 2 countries that I know very well, has plummeted. There is no comparison, at least in the social sciences, at least in economics, between the kind of education students used to get in the 1980s and the kind of education they get today. Today they get a lot of stuff crammed into their heads. Most of it is useless. Most of it would be much better if they didn't have it in their minds. Now, when they go to corporations to work for them, they need to be deprogrammed. I talk to personnel managers in large corporations, and they say that, especially the economists, the first thing they need to do is to try to delete from their memories everything they've learned at university, because it is not only useless, but it is actually inimical to their functioning in universities. And there's a whole process which explains that, the sociology of knowledge, the sociology of the profession. Quality has been pushed out by quantity. In the process of quantification, measurement was the greatest enemy of knowledge.
Did you enjoy teaching, and were Sydney Uni students any different to the students in Athens who you taught later in your career?
In Sydney, first year class, 300.
Must have been
sometimes 350. Well, it actually was great fun. I really enjoyed it. But it was more like crowd control than actually teaching, and especially with the rugby players that were sitting further away towards the back. And you know, they could smell the fear in the lecturer, and they loved to make you cry as their teacher. And there were quite a few colleagues of mine who would end up in tears and would simply drop out of those classes and refuse to continue teaching them. So it was an arena.
Right.
But I loved it. It was great fun for me. And I still meet today, 20 years, 25, 30 years later, I meet people that I taught back then in London who say, "Oh, you were my lecturer in first year in Sydney University." And so
You were there for 12 years, weren't you?
I was there for 12 years.
So tell me about your Australian life. What did you enjoy about living in Australia? And are there any other points to consider in relation to your life in Britain?
Well, what I enjoyed the most was in the University of Sydney, the campus. I really loved living there because I will spend most of my day and night on campus. I really enjoyed the campus itself. It was a very pleasant campus. It was nice to be able to look at the city downtown from the hill where Sydney University is located without actually having to go into the city. And then bypassing the city, going to Bondi Beach for a swim. So the combination of my office, the library, cinemas nearby in the Glebe area, Newtown area, downtown, the beach, the gym, the office, the library, the cinema. That was the circuit that ruled my life while I was there.
Do you still follow Australian politics? Any special mentions?
Well, I do try to keep up with the goings on in Australia's political economy. But I find it very depressing to be perusing the news regarding the political shenanigans, the way in which the office of the Prime Minister has been completely denigrated by a series of coups within the party rooms, beginning with the way in which Kevin Rudd was overthrown. And then now it's so difficult to catch up, to keep up with who the Prime Minister is and what the various plots against him or her might be. And it's a political process which is completely meaningless. It's not a clash of ideas, of ideologies, of political priorities, of policies. Here you've got just a clash of personalities, and very ugly personalities at that. Where is Paul Keating? You know, where you know, even people like John Hewson, that used to be a joke back then. I appreciate him now. He was a towering figure compared to the current crop.
Even as the gap divides between the haves and have-nots, well, it widens in Australia, people still feel that class is not destiny in Australia, as it seems to be in Britain and the old world. What do you say to that?
Well, this is a very favourite and well-entrenched illusion that the Australians have about themselves. This idea that Australia is a classless society is one of the national myths. It is an important glue and cement that keeps Australian society together, but it is a lie. It is a gigantic lie. If you're born into the Australian working class, the Australian precariat, the Australian marginalized segment, then your life chances are minuscule. Your chances of social mobility are next to zero. They're even lower than they are in other countries that do not have this myth of being a classless society. But then again, myths are important. As I said, they provide the glue and the cement of societies. You
don't think that a student or a child from a working class family can break out of that cycle and become successful and I guess change their class? Not more so than in other countries that don't have this myth. It used to be the case. In the Australia that I knew, up until the 1990s, that was true. So if in the 1970s, especially after the reforms by Gough Whitlam, you managed to get into university from a working class background, you did well. And you could climb on the strength of your own resources and capacities. Now, no. This is, the universities are no longer operating like the springboard that catapult people from one social class to another. You end up with large student debt. The quality of education you get is minuscule compared to what you used to get. And even if you do get it, the deindustrialization of Australian society and the conversion of whole sectors of the economy into rent-seeking, you know, real estate-based, resource-based, a very primitive form of capital accumulation, to put it in economic terms, makes it very difficult for substantial numbers of young people to rise up. The old person can always rise up, but that is the case also in the most unequal, class-ridden society.
the more class-ridden and unequal a society is, the higher some people rise within its ranks, while most people don't.
Was Australia once the lucky country for you, and do you believe it still is?
No, I always thought that this expression is very stupid. No country is lucky. You make your luck, and it's got to do with struggles that are collective and sustained. Let's not forget that the greatest curse for any people, anywhere in the world, is to have a lot of minerals, oil, gas. If you look at Gabon, if you look at Nigeria, the curse of the natural resources is there. To a very large extent, Australia is cursed by having all this land and all these resources. The people of Australia have done an enormous amount of work in that country, and they have done it very well to create a social democracy, to create, Medicare, to create a social security system that works much better than in many other parts of the world, especially in Europe. But that wasn't luck. It was hard work. It was hard struggles. It was trade unions fighting for rights. It was women fighting for rights. It was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of hard work and endeavor. And if anything, Australia has been hampered by too many mineral resources, too much coal, too much land which was available to be destroyed by Western civilization, deforestation, salination, and so on and so forth.
How do you think Australia is perceived then internationally in terms of people, culture, politics?
Well, Australia in the 1960s and 1970s did a great service to itself by exporting important intellectuals into the United States, Britain, and a few others in Europe. And those people were ambassadors for Australia, and they created a very good image for Australia around the world. The film industry from the 1970s and 80s, which is now dead, but the film industry in the 1970s and 80s, which was aided by a particular tax regime and financial assistance, the movies of Peter Weir and so on, they also played a very significant role in creating a good image for Australia overseas. The hordes of Australians spending a year off, gap year, also have shaped the Australian image in a good way, because Australians are nice, affable people. But the governments of Australia have done enormous damage to the image of Australia by participating in every imperialist, disgusting war that the United States have ever waged, from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. The fact that Australian governments are so keen to send young Australian men and women to die in other people's wars that end up making the world a worse place, with the exception of the Second World War, let's say. Every other war that Australia has participated in has depleted the social capital of Australians abroad.
My question to you about Australia's historical and political alliance with America, and I guess the current US-China disputes, do you think that is going to impact on Australia? The fact that America and China are feuding at the moment with taxes and those things, do you think that because America has a good relationship with Australia and has a pretty good relationship with China, do you think that's going to damage
Australia must always have a good relationship with the United States. Australia must have a good relationship with everyone. Good relations are a great asset. But it's one thing to have a good relationship, and it's quite another to be subservient. It's quite another to become, the 51st state without even having state rights within the United States. Not having an independent defense policy, not having an independent foreign policy, simply being the tail that the Washington DC beast is wagging is not in the interests of Australia. And you don't have to be a left-winger to believe that. Plenty of the older guard within the Liberal Party would agree with that. Former prime ministers would agree with that. At the moment, the United States policy of encircling China, of being inimical to China, of creating circumstances of a trade war with China, and at the same time, and this is not just Trump, the Obama administration was doing exactly the same thing with TPP, trying to cut China off its vital space around the Asian Pacific region. This, firstly, is against the interests of the people of the United States, but it's certainly not a game that Australia should be playing. Now with Donald Trump, with the toxic racist right being in control of the White House, and the Liberal Party in Australia being led by dwarfs who are emulating whatever Mr. Trump is doing. For instance, the attempt to appease the Trump administration by taking a pro-Netanyahu position in Israel, and doing it in a half-hearted way with the question about the embassy moving to Jerusalem or not moving to Jerusalem or moving to half of Jerusalem. The Australian government is continuing to do a major disservice to the interests of the Australian people in the area and worldwide.
So I guess if you were in a position of power, what would you advise?
Well, I can advise without being in a position of power. That's the whole point about not being in power. One advises. No, my advice would be to develop an independent, sensible, peaceful Australian foreign policy. One that aims at maintaining an equal distance and also building equally important and powerful bonds, both with the United States and with China. China is a pillar of world stability. Whether we like it or not, without China, the world as we know it would collapse today. The United States would have collapsed had it not been for the Chinese authorities' economic policy from the GFC, the Great Financial Crisis of 2008 onwards. Two things have kept the global economy from utterly collapsing in 2008. One was the Fed, the Central Bank of the United States, and the other was China. So watching Mr. Trump antagonize the Chinese while at the same time increasing the American deficit, which means that he needs the Chinese to be buying American bonds to be financing the deficit of the United States, you realize that there is an incongruity there. Something is wrong with the world. And that this is going to cause only instability from which Australia is going to suffer. So my advice would be try to play go-between. That would be a very honourable role for Australia.
Okay, well I think one of the more important topics for you right now might be the Greek elections that are coming up. Whether they're in October or earlier, one doesn't know that at this moment in time, but how do you see the economic future here in Greece?
Well, if I could see a decent economic future, we would not have created the Mera-25 or political party. This is our little swallow sign for it, because the last thing I want is to be involved in party politics and to be creating a new party from scratch. It's not what I want to live for. But because there's no economic future, the way we're going. For the last 10 years, we have a quadruple bankruptcy in Greece. We have a bankrupt state, we have bankrupt banks, bankrupt families, and bankrupt corporations of companies, business. And you cannot escape this bankruptcy by pretending that you're not bankrupt and borrowing more and more and more money. Loans that are given to you on conditions of austerity that shrink your incomes. That is a recipe for permanent stagnation, permanent depression. So Mera-25 will be running in the elections, both the national elections and the European Parliament elections, with particular policy proposals. We are the only party that have already published our electoral manifesto, economic policy, social policy, foreign policy, in advance so that citizens can peruse it and make up their own mind.
Make their decisions. So what changes would you like to see here to improve the living standards of the people?
Well, the first thing, of course, is when you are bankrupt, you need to restructure your loans. That applies to any business, to any family, to any entity. If you're bankrupt, you have to escape bankruptcy. And the only way to escape bankruptcy is by an agreement with your creditors that restructure your loan, effectively effect a haircut on the loans. That's condition number one. If we don't do that, there is no future. And the reason why I'm saying that is because when you are pretending that you're not bankrupt, you are setting targets for the surplus from the amount of money you will extract from the economy to give to the creditors. And how will you extract it? You will extract it through incredibly high tax rates. So this cup of coffee here is 24% sales tax.
That's right.
Trying to introduce 24% sales tax in Australia and see what happens to the economy. Small businesses have to pay next year's tax and this year's tax this year. Try to introduce that in Australia. Make small business, or any businesses, prepay next year's tax this year. You destroy the economy. This is what the creditors have imposed upon this country. So when you're pretending that you're repaying your debts, and you can't, you have to set yourself targets for extracting money from the economy, which destroys the economy. So it's like a cow that is sick, and you have promised to produce a lot of milk out of it, and you keep hitting it, clobbering it, to produce more milk. At some point it will die, there will be no milk. So debt restructure is the necessary condition, not the sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for any progress in this country.
Does black money still exist in Greece?
When I was in the government, when I was in the ministry, I was telling our creditors, people at the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank and so on, look, what we need in Greece is a new social contract. What I wanted to do as a Minister of Finance was to give a press conference and make an announcement. We're turning the page. And here's the deal, folks. I will reduce the tax rates and you pay them. How about that? That works because people out there do not want, they feel put out and they feel undignified to be dealing in black money. But when you've got 24% VAT, sales taxes, and gigantic other kinds of taxes, effectively you're pushing people into a corner between going bankrupt and not paying their taxes. And I cannot blame them if they opt for the latter. I think it is the job of the Ministry of Finance, of the government, to create circumstances so that people who want to be law-abiding can be law-abiding. And what happened after I resigned? The creditors and the government effectively increased the tax rates further. So making this dilemma inescapable.
What do you think the people of Greece actually think of you as a future politician in this country?
Well, these are polarizing times. When you have an economy that has collapsed in a Great Depression, think of Germany in the 1920s, think of the United States in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression. Similarly here, from 2010, I'm depersonalizing it, and then I will answer your question directly. You have a society which is effectively at war with itself, a society which is feeding off discontent, a society where politics becomes toxic, where the media goes bankrupt and they are in the pockets of the oligarchy and of the creditors. And therefore they are fueling discontent by taking extreme positions either on one side or the other. So these are polarizing times. And I very much fear that I've acquired, personally speaking now, the two kinds of people that I never wanted. Fans and enemies. I never wanted either. The problem with fans is that they will believe whatever I say before I've said it, not good. And with enemies, that they will reject whatever I say before I've said it, not good. It will be good. Democracy is predicated upon having an open mind. And I'm afraid that minds have been closed by the inauspicious circumstances. So I have, if we walk down the street together, you'll find that most people are extremely positive and sympathetic and actually touching with me. But there are other people who think that I am devil incarnate. This is a reflection, not on me, but it's a reflection on the circumstances of the place.
Lastly, where do you see yourself in 5 years from now?
Well, I would very much like not to have to do politics anymore and to be able to stay at home and write my books and give the occasional lecture and go to meetings and have fun. And that's my aspiration. But I very much fear that I will still be in this political arena that is the place for struggling to maintain the vision of a democratic future.
Well, good luck with your new party, and thank you very much for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gina.